Hitler asked Spain to join his war, and Franco handed him an invoice. On 23 October 1940, in a railway carriage at Hendaye on the French frontier, the two men talked for 9 hours and produced almost nothing. Hitler wanted Gibraltar. What he got was a list, hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat, fuel oil, artillery, aircraft, and, the item that stuck, French Morocco and Oran, carved out of a Vichy France whose cooperation Germany still needed. Hitler later remarked he would rather have several teeth pulled than repeat the conversation. There was a protocol. Spain agreed to enter the war on the side of the Axis at a date to be fixed by common agreement. That last phrase was the entire substance of Franco's evasion, and both sides knew it. A promise without a date is not a promise. It is a receipt for a negotiation still in progress. Berlin proceeded anyway. Führer Directive No. 18, issued 12 November 1940, ordered preparation of Operation Felix, German troops across Spain, the seizure of the Rock, the closing of the strait. On 7th of December, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris arrived in Madrid to name the day at last, 10 January 1941. Franco refused. His people were on bread rations, his gold was gone, spent in the Civil War, and his wheat and oil came in under British novitiates. He could not fight a war on credit he did not have. On 11th of December, Hitler suspended Felix, but the refusal was never a matter of principle, only of price, and prices can be met. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened had that bill been paid, and why the real history unfolded differently. The German offer changed shape over that hard winter. What Franco had been offered in October were promises contingent on Spanish entry. What he was offered in January was delivery in advance. Grain moved overland from occupied France before a single Spanish soldier crossed a border. The heavy artillery he had demanded arrived as freight rather than as a clause. Berlin, having decided that Gibraltar was worth more than the negotiating leverage, simply stopped negotiating and started paying. Morocco remained the sticking point, and it was fudged in the way such things are always fudged, deferred to the peace settlement, promised in language vague enough for both men to sign and specific enough for Franco to show his generals. Serrano Suñer, the foreign minister who had been Berlin's channel into Madrid since October, pushed the fiction along. On the 12th January 1941, 5 weeks after refusing Canaris, Franco signed a dated entry protocol. Within the week, Hitler reinstated Operation Felix. The plan had never been dismantled. Reichenau would command. Kübler's XLIX Mountain Corps would make the assault with the siege artillery and the assault engineer methods that had cracked Eben-Emael in a single morning. The timetable was the old one, slipped a few weeks, the frontier crossed in February, the Rock assaulted in March. The consequences of that signature reached far beyond a fortress. But first, it is worth understanding exactly what Gibraltar was and what it was not. German columns crossed the Pyrenees and moved south through Spain unopposed, along roads and rail lines that a Spanish army too broken to fight had been ordered to keep open. There was no campaign. There was a transit. Gibraltar's problem was structural and old. The fortress had been built and armed to dominate a strait. Its guns were laid for ships. They were not laid for howitzer batteries emplaced a few kilometers inland on Spanish soil. On ground the garrison could not patrol, could not raid, and could not deny. The isthmus was flat, narrow, and overlooked from the north. The civilian population had been evacuated in 1940 to Britain, Jamaica, and Madeira. The deep tunnel network that would later shelter an army was only beginning to be cut. Lieutenant General Sir Clive Liddell commanded a garrison in a position whose entire defensive logic assumed a friendly or neutral Spain behind it. Artillery worked the Rock from the Bay of Algeciras and the shore batteries. Dive bombers came in from Spanish fields. Kübler's mountain troops closed on the isthmus. The harbor became unusable first, that is always what happens, and the fortress surrendered in under a month. It is worth being precise about what this cost Britain, because the Mediterranean had already been closed to through merchant traffic since mid-1940. Egypt-bound cargo was already going round the Cape, 2 months each way. Gibraltar was never the artery. It was the hinge, a naval base, a convoy assembly point, the western door. Somerville did not wait to be destroyed at anchor. Force H, built around Renown, Ark Royal, and Sheffield, since its formation in June 1940, put to sea before the harbor became untenable, and paid for the withdrawal in the approaches where land-based air had every advantage. What Fliegerkorps X had done to illustrious off Malta on a 10th January 1941 was the demonstration. The strait was narrower water still. The ships that survived reformed at Freetown in Sierra Leone, 1,400 miles to the south. Read that distance carefully. Between the British Isles and Freetown, the Royal Navy now held no base at all. The whole eastern Atlantic, the convoy routes, the approaches to the Iberian coast, the sea lanes that fed Britain, had to be worked from either end of a gap longer than the North Sea. Both shores of the strait were now Axis-held: Spanish Morocco, Ceuta, Melilla, and Tangier, which Spain had occupied in June 1940. The passage that in the real war cost the U-boat arm heavily, a narrow, current-swept, patrolled funnel that killed boats going in, became routine. Submarines entered the Mediterranean months earlier and in far greater numbers than they historically managed. Spain, meanwhile, discovered the price of its bargain. The Navasset stopped. The Anglo-American wheat and oil that Sir Samuel Hoare had meted out of Madrid with such deliberate care, the entire architecture of leverage that had kept Spain neutral, was withdrawn the moment leverage no longer had a purpose. The German grain trains could not replace American tankers and Argentine wheat in a Europe already short. The famine Franco had cited as his reason for staying out arrived as a consequence of going in. Iberia stopped being an operation and became an occupation. Portugal's neutrality had rested on the fiction that the peninsula was not a theatre. With German forces on the Tagus side of Spain, that fiction collapsed. Berlin's contingency for occupying Portugal's Atlantic ports, the plan the real war filed as Isabella in May 1941, was pulled forward and executed against a country whose alliance with Britain dated to 1333. Britain reached for the plans it had kept in reserve precisely for this. The Canaries were taken by force. The Portuguese Atlantic Islands, the Azores, Cape Verde, were negotiated where Salazar's government in crisis permitted and seized where it did not, at real cost to a relationship Britain would need for the rest of the war. All of it, the occupation divisions, the coastal artillery, the transport, the fuel, came out of the same finite pool that Directive 21, signed on the 18th of December 1940, had committed to the invasion of the Soviet Union. This is the part that matters most and is easiest to overstate. Gibraltar's fall closed a door. It did not open Moscow, and it did not open London. What it did was force Germany to garrison a second theatre 5 months before it began the largest land campaign in history. Every ton for Egypt now went round the Cape, without exception, and without the occasional convoy fought through from the west. The escort pattern for the South Atlantic had to be rebuilt from scratch around Freetown and the newly taken islands, more escorts, longer legs, fewer sailings, and a shipping cycle stretched by months at a time when the tonnage did not exist. Malta was the clearest casualty. Unreachable from the west and barely reachable from Alexandria, the island was starved down past the point of usefulness. Its bombers and submarines stopped cutting the convoys crossing to Libya, and the supply line that in the real war strangled the Axis in North Africa ran open instead. And then came the moment that the entire cascade had been building toward, the one on which Anglo-American strategy in the West actually turned. Operation Torch, as it was really planned, does not exist in this timeline. The landings at Oran and Algiers were inside the Mediterranean. Eisenhower's headquarters was inside the rock, in the tunnels. Every assumption of that operation began with Gibraltar in Allied hands, and none of them survive its loss. A landing at Casablanca, mounted directly across the Atlantic from the United States, remains physically possible. That force sailed in the real war and could sail here. The honest point is not impossibility, but exposure. It would go ashore under German air power based in southern Spain and Spanish Morocco, on a flank that could not be suppressed, with no covered anchorage anywhere on the coast and no way into the Mediterranean afterward. A beachhead, not a campaign. So the argument in London and Washington turns elsewhere, toward West Africa, toward securing the Cape route, toward a cross-channel invasion on a timetable nobody was remotely ready for. The war does not end differently in a week or a month. It ends later, and it costs more, and it is fought on a map with one fewer option in it. That is the shape of what Franco declined. In the real history he held out, through Hendaye, through Canaris, through the whole war, because he was hungry, because his army was spent, and because Sir Samuel Hoare made sure the wheat kept arriving in exactly the quantities that made neutrality the better bargain. The most consequential decision of the Western Mediterranean was not made by a general. It was made by a man counting grain and choosing, for reasons that had nothing to do with courage, not to sign.